The candle had burned down to its last inch by the time Eliza found the courage to open the diary a second time. She had not meant to keep it past the hour she found it. She had meant to dust the escritoire in the shuttered chamber, close the drawer she had pried loose by accident, and say nothing to anyone. That had been the plan at noon, when the room still smelled of dust sheets and old lavender, and nothing in it seemed capable of undoing her. By midnight the plan had failed entirely, and she sat in the library with the small brown book open on her knees, reading A Dead Woman's Hand by a Dying Flame. She heard him before she saw him. A step on the library floor, unhurried, and then nothing, as though he had stopped the instant he understood what he was looking at. Eliza did not close the book. She had learned, in 6 years of service, that a guilty motion was often more damning than stillness, and so she sat with her spine straight and her eyes lifted to find the Duke of Rothermere standing in his own doorway with his coat still on from wherever the evening had kept him, looking at her the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately place. The library around them held its usual smell of leather and cold ash, the tall windows black with the hour, and somewhere beyond them an owl called once and did not call again. The whole great house gone still and listening, as though it too had been caught out past its bedtime. His gaze went from her face to the book to her face again. He did not ask what she was doing there. He did not ask whose hand had written the pages open in her lap, though she thought, from the sudden stillness in his jaw, that he already knew. "That was my mother's," he said. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without raising it. "Yes, Your Grace." Eliza's own voice came out steadier than she expected. "I did not mean to read it. I found it in the escritoire, and I could not, in the end, put it down unread." He crossed the room. He did not reach for the diary. He looked at it the way another man might look at a door he had spent 3 years deciding not to open, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name, and would spend the better part of a season trying to. "There is a name in it," Eliza said, before she could stop herself. "A name I do not think anyone in this house has spoken aloud in a very long time." The Duke did not answer. He only looked at her a moment longer, and then he said quietly that she should take herself to bed, and that they would speak of this in the morning, and he left her sitting there with the candle guttering and the small brown book still open to a page that had not yet finished frightening her. She did not know, that night, that the diary in her lap would end by remaking the shape of her whole life. She knew only that the Duke of Rothermere had looked at her as though she were a person worth looking at, and that no one in Ashworth House had looked at her quite that way before. Eliza Fenwick had come to Ashworth House at 16, an orphan with a good hand for needlework and no family to place her anywhere better. Her father had been a parish schoolmaster who died of a fever the same winter her mother did, and the vicar who arranged her placement had told her, not unkindly, that she was fortunate to be taken into so great a house at all. Eliza had understood, even at 16, that fortune of that particular kind came with its price already written into the contract, and she had paid it without complaint for 6 years, rising slowly from scullery to housemaid, which was itself a kind of quiet triumph in a household run by Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the Duke's great-aunt, who noticed servants chiefly when they failed her. Eliza had learned to move through the great rooms as though she were furniture with opinions she kept to herself, to curtsy at the correct depth for a countess and a lesser depth for a countess's companion, to carry a coal scuttle without letting the ash mark her apron, to be, in every practical sense, invisible. She rose before the house did, and slept after it had gone dark. And in the narrow hour each evening that was truly her own, she sat in the servants' hall, mending linens by rushlight, and listening to Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper, recite the small gossip of the county as though it were scripture, she did not resent it exactly. She had grown up learning that a girl without name or fortune survived by being useful and unremarked. And she had made her peace with that arithmetic the way one makes peace with weather. What she had not made peace with, what still caught in her chest on the worst mornings, was the particular quality of Lady Beatrice's attention when it did fall on her. It was the attention one gives a stain on a good tablecloth. Something to be addressed, and then forgotten. "She is nothing to trouble yourself over," Lady Beatrice had said once to a visiting cousin who had asked, not unkindly, after the pretty housemaid in the blue apron. "Just a girl from the parish. One hardly notices her at all." She had said it in the passage outside the morning room, believing herself unheard. And Eliza, carrying linens past the half-open door, had heard every word, and carried it with her the rest of the day, like a stone in her shoe. Ashworth House itself sat on high ground, above a valley of beech and old stone, a house built for a family that had held its title since before living memory, and it had never, in Eliza's 6 years there, felt entirely warm. The old Duke had died when Julian was 25, and the Duchess had followed him into the family vault only 3 years past, in a winter so cold the ground had to be broken with picks. Since then, the house had run on habit rather than joy. The Duke worked. Lady Beatrice presided. The servants kept the fires lit and asked no questions about the shuttered wing where the late Duchess's rooms had stood untouched, dust sheets over the furniture, curtains drawn against a light no one came to see by. She had, in her own quiet way, already earned a small reputation among the staff for a kind of stubborn decency that did her no practical good. The previous winter, when a footman named Harker had been accused of pilfering brandy from the cellar, Eliza had gone to Mrs. Prentice and admitted, at some cost to her own comfort, that she had seen the under-butler take the missing bottles himself and replace them with a story convenient to no one but him. Nothing had come of the telling beyond a quiet correction below stairs, and Eliza had gained nothing from it but Harker's gratitude and the under-butler's cold civility for a month afterward. She had done it anyway, because the alternative was letting an innocent man be turned off without a character. And she found she could not make her peace with that kind of silence, even when silence would have served her better. It was Lady Beatrice who had finally ordered the wing opened for spring cleaning, with the offhand instruction that anything of the late Duchess's private effects should be brought to her directly, and nothing else. Eliza had drawn the wing in the rotation without particular feeling. She had polished the andirons and beaten the carpets, and worked her way, methodically, to the small writing desk in the window alcove, where a drawer had stuck fast with age, and, when at last it gave, released not household correspondence, but a slim brown diary bound in calf leather, its clasp broken, a single-pressed forget-me-not flower marking a page near the middle. She should have carried it straight to Lady Beatrice. She had told herself so at least 6 times before curiosity, which had always been her one unservant-like vice, got the better of her judgment. And she opened the cover to see whose hand it was, only to find, in careful looping script, the words that this book belonged to Margaret, Duchess of Rothmere, and that whoever found it after her should burn it unread. Eliza did not burn it. She read 3 pages standing at the window, and then she sat down on the dust-sheeted chair because her legs no longer felt entirely trustworthy. And by the time the light failed, she had read a dozen more, and she understood that the flower marked a page where the Duchess had written, in a hand grown suddenly less careful, a single name. Thomas. Not the old Duke's name. Not any name Eliza had ever heard spoken in that house, not by the servants, not by Lady Beatrice, not once in 6 years. and something in the careful violence with which the entry had been written, the ink pressed so hard it had nearly torn the page, told her that this omission had not been accidental. She had carried the diary to the library that night, meaning only to finish the page by better light, and it was there, past midnight, that the Duke had found her. He came to the small parlor off the breakfast room the next morning before the rest of the house had risen, and Eliza was summoned there by a footman who plainly disapproved of housemaids being summoned anywhere by dukes. Julian Ashworth stood at the window with his back to the door and did not turn when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I have not read it," he said finally. "Not since she died." "I could not." "I am sorry, Your Grace. I ought to have brought it to Lady Beatrice unread. I have no excuse for what I did instead." He turned then and studied her with an attention that made her acutely aware of the darn in her apron and the plainness of her cap. "What did you read?" She could have lied. She thought, looking at the tightness around his mouth, that a kinder woman might have. Instead, she told him the truth, that his mother had loved a man named Thomas before she married his father, that the love had not ended cleanly, and that the pages she had read were the pages of a woman who had spent 30 years missing someone she had been made to give up. Something crossed his face that she would spend weeks trying to name correctly. Grief, certainly, and something else beneath it. Something that looked almost like relief, as though a suspicion he had carried a long time had finally been given a shape he could look at directly. "Bring it to me," he said. "Not to my aunt. To me." It was, Eliza would understand only later, the first command he had ever given her that was not really about the diary at all. The weeks that followed rearranged themselves around that single instruction in ways Eliza did not fully notice until they had already happened. She brought the diary to the Duke's study each evening once the house had quieted, and he read a little more of it each time, slowly, as a man rations water in a drought, and she was permitted, by some understanding neither of them spoke aloud, to remain while he read, mending linens by the fire, so that her presence could be explained to anyone who asked. He did not speak often while he read, though there were evenings he set the book down and told her, without preamble, some fragment of his childhood that the pages had shaken loose, that his mother had been quiet at breakfast and quieter at dinner, that she had played the pianoforte only when she believed herself alone, and had stopped entirely the year he turned 12, that his father had been a decent man and a dutiful one, and that Julian had grown up believing dutiful was the largest thing a marriage could hope to be. "I do not know what I believed love looked like," he told her one evening, watching the fire rather than her. "I only knew what I had seen, and what I had seen looked like two people being extremely correct with each other for 30 years. Eliza did not know how to answer a Duke's confession, so she said only that correctness and love were not always the same weather, and he looked at her then with an attention that made her hands go still over the linen in her lap. There were practical difficulties to the arrangement that Eliza noticed, even as she found herself unwilling to end it. She was meant to be abed by 10, and instead sat mending by his fire past midnight most evenings, a fact that would have scandalized Lady Beatrice thoroughly had she known its full extent. Eliza told herself in the beginning that she remained only because he had asked her to, and because a Duke's request was not a thing a housemaid refused. By the second week, she no longer troubled herself with that particular fiction. She remained because the hour by his fire had become, without her quite choosing it, the 1 hour of her day she looked forward to before it arrived. He was, she was coming to understand, a man who protected by ordering rather than by asking. Coming inside out of a sudden rain, he told her to take his coat before she caught a chill, in a tone that brooked no argument, and she wore it the length of the terrace with her heart beating harder than the weather accounted for. Finding her still at her mending long past the hour the rest of the house had retired, he told her to eat something before she made herself ill with work, and had a footman bring a tray she had not asked for and did not know how to refuse. She heard the commands as commands, because that was what they were, but she felt underneath each one something that did not belong in the vocabulary of a housemaid's employment, and she did not yet permit herself to name it. Lady Beatrice named it for her, in a manner of speaking, on an afternoon in early April. She had come upon Eliza in the corridor outside the Duke's study, diary in hand, on her way to the evening's reading, and had stopped her with a look that required no words at all before finding words regardless. "I do not know what game you imagine you are playing," Lady Beatrice said, low enough that no servant passing might hear. "But you would do well to remember what you are. A housemaid with a pretty face, and an unfortunate habit of reading things not meant for her. My nephew is a duke, girl. He is not in the habit of noticing girls like you, and when he tires of whatever novelty you presently represent, you will find yourself very quickly reminded of your place." Eliza said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing with Lady Beatrice was like arguing with weather, and she curtsied and continued down the corridor with the diary held against her chest, like something that might be taken from her. Though what precisely she feared losing, she could not yet have said aloud. Eliza believed, in the days that followed, that she saw the shape of Lady Beatrice's plan more clearly than the old woman intended her to. A house was easier to run on certainty than on affection, and Lady Beatrice had spent 30 years certain of exactly what an Ashworth marriage ought to look like, a certainty that had survived the old Duke's death and the Duchess's death both, unshaken by either loss because it had never truly depended on either of them being happy. Eliza did not hate her for it. She had grown up too poor to afford the luxury of hating people simply for being wrong, and she recognized, even through her own hurt, that Lady Beatrice's rigidity was its own kind of grief, worn so long it had hardened into something the old woman likely no longer recognized as sorrow at all. She did not tell the Duke of the encounter. She told instead Nan Colley, the youngest of the under-housemaids, a girl of 15 who had attached herself to Eliza the way stray creatures attach themselves to the first kind hand they find, and who listened to the story that evening with wide eyes over the mending basket they shared. "She is only frightened," Nan said, with the plain wisdom of the very young. "My gran always said the ones who guard a house hardest are the ones most afraid of what might get in." Eliza thought of that observation more than once in the weeks that followed, as Lady Beatrice's guard visibly tightened. A house party was announced for the last week of April, its guest list built with evident care around the person of Lady Cordelia Fairclough, an heiress of impeccable connection and composed beauty, whom Lady Beatrice had, it became clear, long intended for her nephew. Eliza was assigned to help dress the visiting lady's hair for the first evening's dinner, and stood behind Lady Cordelia's chair, pinning white roses into pale gold curls, while the young woman studied her own reflection, with the untroubled confidence of someone who had never once wondered whether a room wanted her in it. "You are the girl who found the diary," Lady Cordelia said, not unkindly, watching Eliza in the glass. "Lady Beatrice mentioned it. Rather a romantic little scandal for a housemaid to stumble into." "It was not meant to be a scandal at all, my lady. Only a private grief." "Everything in this house is private until someone finds it," Lady Cordelia said, and smiled, and said nothing further. And Eliza finished the pinning with hands that did not entirely feel like her own. The dinner that followed seated 30 at a table, dressed with the family silver, and candles enough to light the whole long room, and Eliza stood against the wall near the sideboard as she had 100 times before, ready to be summoned and otherwise entirely unremarked. It was over the second course that Lady Beatrice, addressing Lady Cordelia's mother in a voice pitched precisely to carry the length of the table, observed that great houses so often suffered from servants who forgot the difference between their situation and their betters. "One finds it a kind of contagion," she said, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. "A housemaid reading where she ought not, imagining an attention that was never truly given, and needing eventually to be reminded rather firmly of what she is." She did not once look toward the sideboard as she said it, and she had no need to. Every head at the table that had heard the rumor of the diary turned, however briefly, toward Eliza, and Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and her hands folded, and did not permit her face to answer the words at all, though she felt them land regardless, precise as a slap delivered in gloves. The Duke's wound surfaced fully on the anniversary of his mother's death, which fell 3 days into the house party, unmarked on any guest's calendar but his own. Eliza found him in the old portrait gallery well past midnight, standing before his mother's likeness with a glass of brandy he had not touched, and she would have withdrawn unseen if he had not spoken first. "She looks happy in the painting," he said, without turning. "She did not sit for it happily. My father commissioned it the year they married, and I have always thought the painter must have invented the smile from nothing, because I do not believe I ever saw her wear it in the flesh." Eliza came to stand a careful distance from him, close enough to answer, far enough to remain a servant. "Perhaps she wore it once, before you were old enough to remember it." "Perhaps." He was quiet a long moment. "I used to believe I had failed to make her happy, that there was some warmth in me I ought to have been able to give her and did not. I built a great deal of my life around correcting that failure. Being useful, being dutiful, being, in every particular, the opposite of whatever I imagined had disappointed her." He turned to look at Eliza directly, and his voice, when it came again, had dropped to something rawer than she had yet heard from him. "The diary tells me it was never mine to correct at all. She had already lost the thing she wanted, long before I was born to want anything from her." "That does not make your grief smaller, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, "but it changes its shape considerably." He looked at the portrait once more, and then back at her, and something in his face made her chest go tight and warm at once. "I have spent 3 years believing that a marriage built on duty rather than love was simply what my family did, what I was meant to do in turn. I am no longer entirely certain I believe that." He did not say more, and Eliza did not ask him to. She carried the unfinished sentence with her the rest of that night regardless, turning it over the way she had once turned over the diary's single unspoken name, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than it comforted her, that she had begun to want things a housemaid had no business wanting. He found her again the following evening, on the terrace where she had gone to take the night air after the last of the guests' candles had been carried up, and this time he did not speak of his mother at all. "I have been trying," he said, coming to stand beside her at the balustrade, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold coming off the stone, "to think of a single reason why what I am about to say is unwise, and I confess I have failed to produce one that satisfies me. Your Grace, there are a great many reasons. My birth, my place in this house, Lady Beatrice's opinion of the arrangement, which you have already heard expressed. I did not ask you to enumerate them. I asked whether I might be permitted to say the thing itself." He turned to face her fully, and his hand came up, slow enough that she could have stepped back from it, and did not. until his fingers rested lightly against the curve of her jaw, warm despite the night air. Her breath caught somewhere she could not locate and did not release. I want you, Eliza, not your discretion, though I am grateful for it. Not your usefulness to my mother's memory, though I owe you a great deal on that account as well. I mean the plainer thing. I have wanted you since the night I found you with that book in your lap, and could not, for the life of me, look away. She stood very still, aware of her own pulse in a way she had never before had cause to notice it, aware of the particular heat of his hand, and the particular cold of the stone beneath her own, aware that the whole shape of the evening had narrowed itself down to the small space between his mouth and hers. I want it too, she said, because there seemed, in that narrowed moment, no honest way to say anything else. I have wanted it long enough to be ashamed of how little I have fought it. He bent his head, and she felt the warmth of his breath before his lips ever reached her, and for one suspended instant neither of them moved at all. The whole weight of what came next balanced between them like a held breath. Then he drew back. Not far. Only far enough to rest his forehead against hers, and exhaled something that was not quite a laugh. Not here, he said low. Not stolen on a terrace where any window might be watching, and not until I have said what I mean to say in front of every soul in that house who has ever called you nothing. You deserve better than a secret, Eliza. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am no longer willing to give you one. She understood, standing there with his forehead still against hers, and his hand still warm along her jaw, that he had just promised her something considerably larger than a kiss, and that the waiting he asked of her, however difficult, was itself a kind of gift she had not expected a duke to think to give. If you have ever stood at the edge of wanting something, and felt, for once, that the wanting might be permitted, you will understand why Eliza climbed the servant's stair that night, hardly touching the steps at all. The dark turn came 4 days later, and it came, as such turns often do, through a door Eliza had not thought to guard. Mrs. Prentice found her first, drawing her aside in the linen passage with a face so troubled that Eliza knew before a word was spoken that something had shifted against her. I was in the still room not an hour past, fetching the good glasses, and I heard her ladyship speaking to Lady Cordelia's mother through the open door, the housekeeper said, low and quick. She said the girl is nothing, a passing fancy his grace will tire of soon enough, and that she means to see her gone from this house within the week, one way or another. I thought you ought to know before it finds you unprepared. Eliza thanked her, and felt the words settle into her chest with a cold, familiar weight. The third time now she had heard herself reduced to nothing by the same mouth, in the third different room, and she had scarcely finished absorbing it when she turned the corner toward the still room and found the trouble already arriving in a different shape entirely. She discovered Nan in tears behind the still room, having been accused by Lady Beatrice of breaking a porcelain shepherdess that had, in fact, been broken by Lady Cordelia's own lapdog the previous afternoon. Lady Beatrice had announced Nan's dismissal without wages and without character, a sentence that would leave a 15-year-old girl with no family and no references walking the road with nothing but the clothes on her back. Eliza went directly to Lady Beatrice's sitting room and told her, plainly and without deference, that the dog had broken the shepherdess, that 3 servants had seen it happen, and that dismissing Nan for another creature's clumsiness was an injustice she would not stand silent for. Lady Beatrice's face went very still. You forget yourself. I have not forgotten myself at all, my lady. I have simply decided that some things matter more than my place. It was then that Lady Beatrice produced, from a drawer of her writing table, a small purse of coin, and set it on the table between them with the precision of a woman closing a transaction. "Take this, and the diary you have made such use of, and be gone from this house by morning. I have no wish to see either of you again. I will not sell you my silence, my lady, and I will not surrender a book that is not mine to give. Then you leave me no choice." Lady Beatrice's voice, when it came again, had gone glacial. "You are dismissed, effective this hour, for theft of household property, and for conduct unbecoming a servant of this house. I will see that no respectable household in the county takes you in after this. A girl who reads another woman's grief to angle for a duke's attention deserves nothing better than the road she came from." It was the third time Eliza had heard the accusation laid against her, though this time it was spoken to her face rather than behind a half-closed door, in the presence of Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper, who stood white-lipped and silent by the window and would tell Eliza afterward, in the corridor, with real distress in her voice, that she had never in 30 years of service seen an injustice done so coldly. Eliza packed her few belongings that same hour. She did not seek the Duke out to explain herself, telling herself it was pride, and knowing, in the honest part of her chest, that it was fear. He had said nothing when Lady Beatrice's decree reached him, or if he had said something, no word of it had reached the servants' hall before Eliza left it. She walked down the long drive at first light with her small trunk on a borrowed cart, past the beech trees just beginning to leaf, and told herself that whatever she had imagined growing between herself and a duke had been exactly as foolish as Lady Beatrice always insisted it was. If you have ever loved someone above your reach, and told yourself, walking away, that you had never truly hoped at all, you will know precisely how little that telling helps. She had gone no further than the village inn, 3 miles from the house, intending to wait there for the mail coach, when a rider overtook the cart at a pace that startled the horse and very nearly startled Eliza from her seat. The Duke of Rothmere dismounted before his horse had properly stopped and stood in the inn yard with his coat unbuttoned and his hair disordered by hard riding, looking at her as though he had feared, for the length of that ride, that he would not find her at all. "You were dismissed," he said, "without my knowledge, and without my consent, and you left this house believing I had permitted it. I did not know what to believe, Your Grace. I only knew I had been told to go." "Then you were told wrong." He crossed the inn yard and stopped close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes. "I have spent this house party watching you defend a frightened girl, protect a book that was never legally yours to protect, and refuse a bribe that would have made your life considerably easier. And I have concluded, somewhat later than I ought to have, that I have been a coward about what I actually want. Your Grace, please, do not say something you will regret before your family and your guests." "I have no intention of regretting it," he said, "and I have every intention of saying it in front of every person presently assembled in that house this evening, where they can all hear it plainly." The ballroom at Ashworth House had been dressed for the party's final evening with more candles than Eliza had ever seen lit in a single room, and Lady Cordelia stood near the terrace doors in ivory silk, composed and lovely, evidently expecting an announcement that had been arranged for her weeks before Eliza had ever pried open a stuck drawer. Lady Beatrice stood near the orchestra with the satisfied stillness of a woman who believed the evening's business already settled, and did not, at first, mark the small commotion at the ballroom's far doors, where a housemaid in a plain gray traveling dress had just been admitted by a footman, too startled by the Duke's own instruction to refuse her. The music faltered and stopped as Julian Ashworth crossed the floor. He did not cross it quickly. He crossed it the way a man walks toward something he has decided, finally and completely, to claim and the whole glittering room turned to watch him do it, Lady Cordelia's composure faltering for the first time all evening, Lady Beatrice's fan going still in her hand. He stopped before Eliza and took her hand in front of every witness the house contained. "I will marry Miss Fenwick, or no one at all." The silence that followed held the length of 3 full breaths. Lady Cordelia was the first to move, inclining her head with a grace that cost her something visible, and turning quietly toward her mother, murmuring what Eliza would later learn was a request to have the carriage readied for the morning rather than waiting out the season's remaining obligations. Lady Beatrice's fan slipped from her fingers and struck the floor with a sound absurdly loud in the stillness, and when she spoke, her voice had lost, for the first time in Eliza's 6 years of knowing her, every trace of its usual command. "Julian, you cannot mean to throw away everything this family has built for a housemaid." "I mean to build something rather better than what my parents managed," he said, not unkindly. "And I mean to begin by not repeating my mother's mistake. She gave up the person she loved because she was told duty required it. I have read enough of her own hand now to know precisely what that cost her. I will not pay the same price twice in one family." Something in Lady Beatrice's face crumpled then, briefly, into something that looked less like anger than grief of her own. An old woman's recognition, arriving decades too late to matter to the woman it might have helped, and she said nothing further, only sank into the nearest chair with the fan still lying where it had fallen. The room, which had held its breath through the whole exchange, began at last to murmur. And the murmur, Eliza noticed with something like wonder, was not unkind. A dowager countess near the punch table observed, to no one in particular, that she had always found the girl composed and civil for a servant, and had wondered privately why the family did not think better of her. An elderly gentleman by the terrace doors remarked that Rothmere had clearly inherited his grandfather's stubbornness along with his title, and that the family could have chosen worse traits to pass down. Even the orchestra, uncertain whether to resume, held its silence a moment longer, the leader watching the Duke with the frank curiosity of a man who suspected he had just witnessed something worth describing to his grandchildren. Mrs. Prentice stood near the servant's door with both hands pressed to her mouth, and it was she who began, quietly, to applaud. A single pair of hands in a room built for 30 pairs, until a footman near the punch table joined her, and then another, and the sound spread through the room in a way no dowager's disapproval could any longer prevent. Nan, who had been permitted to watch from the gallery above with the rest of the upper servants, pressed both fists to her mouth and wept openly, and did not care in the least who saw her do it. Eliza stood in the center of it with her hand still held fast in the Duke's, feeling the whole shape of her life quietly and permanently rearrange itself, and found she had nothing composed left to say at all. They were married in June, in the small stone chapel on the estate rather than the grand cathedral in town, at Eliza's own quiet request, and the wedding breakfast that followed was modest by the standards of Julian's rank and enormous by the standards of Eliza's raising, Nan Colley among the guests in a new dress Eliza had insisted on, weeping happily through the entire ceremony. Lady Beatrice attended, seated near the front by her nephew's deliberate placement, and though she said little through the day, she sought Eliza out afterward in a quiet corner of the garden and told her, stiffly but without artifice, that she had been wrong about her, and that she hoped, in time, to be permitted to make some small amends for it. Eliza, who had never learned to hold a grudge with any real conviction, told her that amends had already begun the moment she had come to say so, and the old woman's eyes had gone unexpectedly bright before she composed herself and returned to her seat. The diary itself found its final home that autumn, in a small cedar box Julian had commissioned for the purpose. the pressed forget-me-not flower preserved between two panes of glass and set into the lid. He kept it in his study. Not hidden, not paraded, simply present. The way a family keeps the things that taught it something true. On the evening of the first snowfall that winter, Eliza found her husband in the library where he had first found her, a fire lit against the early dark, the cedar box open on the table beside him. He looked up when she entered and held out his hand without a word, the old command folded now into something gentler, an invitation rather than an order, and she crossed the room and took it. "I used to think this room held nothing but my mother's silence," he said, drawing her down beside him. "I find now that it holds rather more than that." Nan came in not long after with a fresh pot of tea, grown these 6 months into an under-housemaid whom Eliza was quietly training toward the housekeeper's chair Mrs. Prentice meant, in time, to hand down. And she set the tray by the fire and lingered a moment, as she still sometimes did, simply to look at the room and the people in it, before returning to her work. Lady Beatrice, who had taken to spending her winter evenings in the small parlor rather than the great drawing room she once preferred, could be heard faintly down the corridor at the pianoforte, picking out a simple air with more patience than skill, a habit she had taken up only that autumn and would not yet admit she enjoyed. Outside the tall windows the snow fell steadily over the beech trees and the long drive where a borrowed cart had once carried a dismissed housemaid away from everything she loved. And inside, by the fire, the pressed flower caught the candle light and held it, and Eliza thought that some houses, given enough patience and enough truth, could finally learn to be warm.